right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Megan Barrett and I am the director at the Iowa Quilt Museum. I am here in the gallery at the Iowa Quilt Museum, and I'm just so happy that you all are joining us today for the very first series, the first session in our series titled Virtual Iowa Quiltscape. We're going to be meeting up each Tuesday at 12 to talk about various aspects of quilting as they are related to the Iowa Quilt Museum and specifically Iowa. Just a couple of housekeeping things. As you're coming in, your video would be off and you should be muted. We just like you to stay that way during this initial part of the conversation so that there are fewer distractions. Do feel free though to use the chat window. We're happy to field any questions that you have. This is a fairly informal conversation. Tangela and I have some rough talking points, but we'll just see where the conversation leads us and go from there. And we will do a little Q&A at the end. We're shooting for 30 to 45 minutes in length today, just so you can plan for yourself. And as I said earlier, this meeting will be available on a recording after the fact if you know somebody who wasn't able to join today. So hopefully now you see there are two spotlighted videos of Tangela and myself. And so let me please introduce everybody to Tangular Irby. She is joining us from Connecticut, where she resides. And today we are visiting about her debut children's book called Pearl and Her G's Bend Quilts. The book just came out on Christmas Day. I think it was released. And I've seen a preview of it. It's fantastic. The pictures look to be really wonderful. And I'm so excited. The reason that that spurred this conversation is we are going to start carrying Pearl and Her G's Bend quilt in our gift shop here at the Iowa Quilt Museum. And so I convinced Tangela to come on with us and give us a little introduction to it. And before the program is finished today, we will let you know how you can get your hands on a copy. So Tangela, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and this fabulous new book that you've just published?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Megan. I am so happy to be here today. So thank you so much. You didn't have to pull my leg or my arms to get me here. I'm very excited to talk to you about my new project. But first of all, as you said, my name is Tangular Irby and I'm a resident of Connecticut. I am a G's Bend legacy. So both of my grandparents are from Alabama. And I remember growing up as a child, seeing the beautiful quilts. And so they've always have been a part of my family and a part of our history. And the beauty of it is that now many people have come to know the quilts of G's Bend. And so my project, as you said, is Pearl and Her G's Bend quilt. Here is the book. And there are a lot of different things that might not be apparent right away in the book. So the first thing I want to share with the people who are with us today is Pearl is actually short for my grandmother's name. My grandmother, my mother's mother, is Pearlie Kennedy Petway. And so Pearl and Her G's Bend quilt is really dedicated in giving honor to her. And the quilt that you see on the cover, and India did a wonderful job in terms of the illustrations, but this quilt on the cover is actually a quilt that we own. It's a quilt that was made by my grandmother. So roughly, I would say it had to have been done over 40 years ago. My grandmother passed away in the early 80s. So it really is an honor and a pleasure to be able to have some of her quilts. My paternal grandmother, who also passed away, many of her quilts burned and there was a house fire back in the early 80s. So we lost a lot of the things that she's created, but there is a quilt in the book that was created by her, and that's Jency Lee Irby. So both of my grandmothers were quilters. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about the book. I mean, there's so many different things. I try to, throughout the book, add little bits and pieces of some of our family history. A lot of the information I actually gathered from my aunt. She is married to my uncle, who happens to be my mother's younger brother, Mary Letha Petway. And in the back of the book, the readers will see a little information about her. So that's there as well. But let me get into the book. So on a lazy Sunday afternoon, Pearl sat playing in the living room with her friends, Sally and Ella, as the aroma of homemade biscuits, smothered chicken, rice, collard greens from the garden, and grandma's famous tea cakes fill the house. So in our family, food and getting together and gathering on Sunday was always a huge tradition. It was just a part of what we did. And so I remember being in Gee's Bend, Alabama, and you always had family coming in and out. But there were so many children, so meals were always big anyway. But there was always something special about Sunday dinner. All right. So, wow, that quilt is amazing, Sally said. My mom has quilts like that at our house. And so, just to show you, here is another quilt. This quilt was actually made by my grandmother, Jency. And so, I have quilts from both of my grandmothers, as I said. Grandma told me I come from a long line of Gee's Bend quilters whose quilts have been displayed in galleries and museums all over, Pearl proudly boasted. When I get older, I'm going to make quilts too. And one of my quilts will hang over there one day. Pearl pointed to the empty space where she intended to display her work. So this is important to me because what we're finding is that the younger generation, many of us, and when I say us, I'm including myself too, have gotten away from the tradition. And so part of what this book highlights is that when children are afforded the opportunity to be with their grandparents, they pick up a lot of the things that their grandparents do, whether it's mannerisms. So when you read the book and you hear Pearl's voice, you know that she's a child, but some of the things that she says, you know that she came to those things because she spent so much time with her grandmother, right? And so she embodies what we want our kids to become. We want our children to pick up those traditions and things that were important to our ancestors and to carry them on. Because if we don't plant those seeds, we're going to lose so much. You know, I think about, for example, there are times that, if you walk into a bakery, for example, there may be something in that bakery that you smell, and it reminds you of something that maybe your grandmother used to make, right? But often you go back and you say, if your grandmother has passed, who has that recipe? Who remembers how to do that? And for many of us, there's no one to get that information from. So if we don't start doing that now, we're really going to lose a lot of our history. And so again, that was one of the motivators behind the book. That's pretty neat. But what are Gee's Bend quilts? I've never heard of that before, Sally asked, wide-eyed. Pearl sat up straight with confidence. Back when my grandma was younger, the house she lived in did not have any heat. So she and her siblings used quilts to keep warm during winter. The families who lived in Gee's Bend, Alabama were very large. Some had 10 or more children, so they needed lots of quilts. So not only did they need lots of quilts, often the quilts were really, really big. You see now that people are making smaller quilts, but back then they needed quilts that were big enough to keep their families warm. And so then from there, the book goes on to talk about some of the processes and how the quilts were actually created, how they pieced together the tops. There's a reference in here to the Freedom Quilting Bee, where a lot of the women in the community worked, and how they would work on quilts there, but at night they had to work on their own quilts. So they would often move from house to house, helping each other to quilt them. But again, it was a lot of work. I talked earlier when I was talking to you, Megan, about how, with putting the book out, I am learning a lot. And that was the whole purpose behind it, because I want to know more about my family history. And so, for example, I had a conversation with my uncle the other day, and he was sharing with me how they would work on the quilts, but and I really wish I could be with him to draw a picture or have him draw a picture to show me exactly what he's talking about. But they actually had ropes in the house so that when after they finish working on the quilts, they can lift the quilts up into the ceiling so people can walk back and forth throughout the house, right? And so he was able to share that with me. And then we were talking, he mentioned to me because he saw the beautiful picture here again from the illustrator of the sewing machine. And so what that made him think about was growing up as a male in the home, often what his job was, if my grandmother's sewing machine broke, he was the one who had to fix it. And that speaks, it really talks to me, it set the stage for who he is now. He's always been one to work with his hands and to fix things. And he was able to cultivate that, helping my grandmother to make sure her sewing machine was up and running. And on top of that, he can also hem his own pants, sew a button if he had to do it. So, so my aunt never had to worry about that because he could do it himself. And it all came because of watching his mother quilt and sew things around the house. So again, just a couple of things that are also in the book. And I don't want to read the entire book to you, but basically what it talks about is Pearl is talking to her friends about wanting to make a quilt one day, and then she's challenged. Oh, I bet you can't make one. So she goes into this whole detailed description about what you need to do to make a quilt. She talks about how, people didn't go to the store to get the fabric. Often they used whatever was around the house. So whether it was an old pair of pants, whether it was, a skirt. I recently had a conversation with, there's a quite a big group of individuals who grew up in Gee's Bend who live in Connecticut. And so we actually had a conversation with a historian about the process and where we are now. And the many of them also quilt. So they were able to talk about what they do. And one of the quilts that was shared was, it was a quilt that was made by her grandmother. And the back of the quilt happens to be a dress that her grandmother had. So she cut the dress up and used that as the back of the quilt. So again, talking about every quilt, there's a story, and I really believe that families need to be more intentional about sharing their stories. And again, it doesn't have to be you writing a book. It could be you writing your story down and sharing that with your siblings or sharing that with your grandchildren or your nieces and nephews. This book is written for the grandmother, it's written for the aunt, it's written for the mother who does not want their traditions to die out with their generation. They really want to encourage people to ask questions and to learn and to pick up some of those skills, that things that really helped in terms of my ancestors. It helped them to survive, right? They didn't have a lot of heat. No electricity. I think about being younger and going down in the summertime. There wasn't any indoor plumbing, for example. Now I remember the house out in the back. If you had to, if you needed a bio break, that's where you went. You had to go outside. So there are a lot of things. And I have two nieces now. I don't have any children of my own. But when I think back, I don't want them to wake up one day and say, "Wow, I wish I had asked." I want that information to be readily available for them, because there's information, there's questions that I have, and even for me, it's getting difficult to find someone who can answer my questions. So, in addition to the storybook, that again, I gave you a little bit of a description about what happens there, but I also have an a coloring and activity book that goes along with it. And so being an educator, I was able to fold in some of the things that I remember doing when I taught second grade for 6 years. And so being able to fold in some of the things that I did with the students there, for example, they always had to talk about or explain if there was a character in the book, what are some of the character traits? How is that character as a person? How would you describe them? So that's a piece of what students are being asked to do here. And actually, there are a couple of situations where I asked them to design their own quilt. And the book talks about, as the artist, the individual quilter, having to actually sign your quilt. And then a lot of the quilts now, the artists are actually naming their quilts. So when you look at that quilt, what do you think about, or what were you thinking about when you were creating it? So I'm asking them to become the creators. And then one of the things that I really, really excited about, because again, it speaks to the mission, is I want them to start writing their own stories. Tell me about your family. What's something about your family that you're proud of? What's something that you're good at that you could explain step by step? So those are just a couple of things in terms of the book that I wanted to share. And currently the book is available at quite a few different outlets. It's at, I'm most proud to say that it is an Amazon #1 new release. It's a bestseller, and it's been ranking every day since the book released on December 26th. So I'm really proud that people are embracing the book. Some of my lifelong friends, so they have children, and I know their children know me, and all of a sudden now they want to talk to me. So they're coming back after reading the book and they have questions, and they have really, really good questions. So, for example, one of the questions was, how did you come up with the names of the characters in the book? Well, in our family, there are often names that are repeated over and over again. And so Ella and Sally are two of the names. Also, my mother's aunts. So she always often talked about Aunt Ella. She often talked about her Aunt Sally. I have a cousin who's named Ella. So these are all people who have really, really important roles in my life. And so one of my ways of honoring them was to use those names in the book. They wanted to know, there are a couple of life lessons in the book. And so I was really, really excited to find out that the same friend, her daughter, actually had a conversation with her dad about what that meant. So in the book, it talks about, you know, we're often comparing ourselves to other people. And there are things that you have a friend that you might want to be able to do things just like your friend. But you know what? You can't do their best. They're doing their best. You can only do your best. And so her and her father had a really detailed conversation about that comment. So, in terms of, and another thing that I wanted to mention, another friend of mine who doesn't have roots in Gee's Bend, Alabama, when her daughter, after reading the book, she told her mom she now wants a Gee's Bend quilt. So it really is exciting to me to hear the conversations that are happening with children after they're reading a book, because it really was the purpose to make them think about something that, if I think about, as an individual, as families, you value certain things, but it's not until other people sometimes see the value in it that you really, really come to know, wow, this is really something special. It's not just something that everyone does, right? So again, it's important to get your stories out there, because then that's how you know and understand. You know, I started quilting. I made my first quilt in, it was probably 2002. I was working at a school and I found out that a woman on staff was a quilter. So I said to her, wow, I want to make a quilt. So I just kept saying it. And finally, I guess she had enough. So I came to work one day and there were a couple yards of fabric on my desk. And she said, okay, what day after school are we going to do this? And so she sat with me. So my first introduction was not learning how to do it the way my family does it, but learning a different way to quilt. And from there, I started going to her friendship quilters meetings. And I learned that there are lots of people who quilt. It really opened my eyes up to the fact that, and I'm talking all walks of life. We didn't all look the same. We didn't all talk the same. Our backgrounds weren't the same. But guess what? We were all sitting there admiring the same quilts, right? So, and I was amazed to see how many quilts that, when you go back and you pull them out, to see the number of quilts that I actually made. But one of the hardest things for me was to, when you first start and you do that first quilt, you don't want to give it away. I'm like, how do you give away one of your quilts? And then a friend of mine had a baby. And I was like, oh no, the baby has to have a quilt. So it really is, it's an act of love, for you to be able to spend as much time as you spend on a quilt and then say that this is something that you want to give away. My family growing up, my grandparents, when their children decided to leave home, and some left to go to the college, some left to go to the service, some left to move up north for a better life, to find a better job so that they can send money back and support their family back in Alabama. So they all had different reasons for leaving. But my grandparents couldn't say, here's $1,000 or here's $2,000. I want to help send you off. They didn't have that. But what they did have was a bundle of love that they put in a quilt, time and energy that they were able to give to their children when they moved away. And so it was, whether it was if someone had a baby, if someone moved, if someone got married, and as an adult now, when you pay attention to other stories, for example, there was an acceptance speech that Tyler Perry gave a couple of months back. And he talked about his experience with when he left and his grandmother giving him a quilt and how he didn't value that quilt at that time. And then years later, he's in an antique store and there's a quilt in there and the price tag on that quilt raises the eyebrows, right? So when he had the conversation with the owner, the person said that that quilt actually belonged to someone who was it was made by someone who was a slave. And in that quilt was the material from the dress when she got married. In that quilt was the outfit that she had on, I think, when she was freed. So there was a whole story behind the quilt. And so you realize that there are so many things that are different about us, but yet there are so many things that are the same. And I think that we need to capitalize on that more and realize that everyone has a valuable story. You don't have to be from Gee's Bend, Alabama to have a valuable story that needs to be shared. And again, the platform, maybe it's a public platform, maybe it's within your family, but you want your kids to know your history. You want them to know their history.
One of the things that I mentioned to Tangela before we actually got started today, that from a museum standpoint, a couple of things stick out to me. One is that idea of storytelling. When we have quilts that we exhibit, especially ones that are historic, what we wish more than anything is that we had the story that went with them. So to have the story that goes with the quilt, I think it's so important to take the time to write the story that goes with your quilt and let that go forward with the quilt. In addition to telling your family's story and your own story, I think we're guilty sometimes of assuming that the story that we have to tell won't be, that nobody will want to hear it, that it won't be valuable to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a complete misnomer. Because we have so often felt that desire to know the story. So don't kid yourself in thinking, oh, nobody's going to want to hear about my quilts or why I made them or anything. Everybody's story is worth telling. And then the other thing that struck out to me from what you were saying, Tangela, is that here at the museum, we're so dedicated to showing both the history of quilting in America to this point, which includes the Gee's Bend tradition, but also the fact that quilting is an art form that's very much alive and well, and we want that to continue. And so your book just really strikes on both of those points, the convergence of history and present and future, and the idea of storytelling, which is just, it's so wonderful. I'm just super excited to see your book in person. I've only ever seen the previews. And what we're doing in our gift shop, it's already uploaded to our online gift shop. And I put the link in the chat window earlier. Because things have moved so quickly, I haven't even placed an order with Tangela for books.
Right.
But we're going to do pre-orders. And then in the next day or so, I'll go ahead and place an order from Tangela for the books that will be in our gift shop. And then I will start shipping those out. A couple of questions that have come up in the chat. First of all, we're all curious about what's behind you, the quilt and the garment. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yes, I can. Well, all four of the pieces that are behind me were actually done by my aunt, Mary Lisa Pettway, who's actually still in Gee's Bend, Alabama. And so the stories behind the quilts, my aunt enjoys quilting. And one of the things that you'll find in the book is she talks a little bit about her style and how her style is a little bit different. And every quilter's style should be a little bit different. And again, we talk about that a little bit more in the book. And these are their panels that you see right here. So they're not large, they're not huge pieces. What we're finding is that there's been such a huge price tag that have been put on the Gee's Bend quilts now that, for example, I don't know that I would ever be able to pay for if I had to find the value of the quilts my grandmothers gave me. And for me, they're invaluable anyway, right? So we wanted to do something, they do things a little bit smaller so that everyone can afford a piece of Gee's Bend quilts. But what I like most about my aunt, she's not afraid to mix different colors. She just does it. It comes to her. She said, and for her, when she's quilting, when she's done, it's a sense of completion, is how she explains it to me. So when she starts out, she may not say, okay, this is going to be big, this is going to be small. She really doesn't know. But when she's there, she knows that this is done. So these were just a couple of pieces that she sent to me that are behind me. Some of them, and you'll find some of them she uses a thicker batting, some of them she uses a thinner batting. So when I say to you that they're all a little bit different, they all are definitely a little bit different. I've seen her send pieces to me. For example, I talked about, so when I was quilting, if I had pieces of fabric or scraps that were left, I would send them to her. And so then recently she sent me back some pieces that actually have in it pieces of material that I use in some quilts that I made. So nothing ever, unless it's garbage, it does not get thrown away. I tease with her, I laugh. So her name is Mary Letha, but we've always called her Mary Lisa. So it wasn't until I became an adult that I realized it's actually Letha. And so I had some tags printed for her to put in the back of her quilt. And I ended inadvertently, well, I didn't know, I spelled her name incorrectly. And it wasn't until I saw her name somewhere else that I called. I said, Auntie, I spelled your name wrong. Stop using those labels. She goes, I will not. I said, but I'm going to sing you new ones. And she said, and I will use them after I finish using these. But you never, and it's a piece of, it's a sense of pride to know that there isn't a sentiment of things are going to be wasted. They use everything. She uses everything. And so that's something, again, that I try to carry in my back pocket as well. And it all goes back to being grateful and thankful for everything that you have. So if you're grateful, if you're thankful, you're not going to waste it. You're going to use it to the best of your ability. And the other thing I just want to point out, and I think it goes back to the time when there was a time when they used to, at the Quilting Bee, they used to use corduroy. And so one of the things that my aunt has picked up on is that, she's not afraid, again, to mix different mediums. So you'll find denim pieces in her quilting. You'll find some corduroy, this piece here. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a piece of corduroy here that's embedded in them. So it's interesting to me because I said earlier that I am really on a quest to learn as much as I can about my family history. I don't sit here today and tell you that I know everything, but what's interesting is when I'm online and I learn something, then I go back and say, oh, wait a minute, this was something that this happened before, that, they're reusing those scraps. So when I make those connections, I'm really happy to say, okay, now I know where this came from. So again, it's a sense of pride. I thank you for asking me about these pieces because I put them here because I wanted people to see her work. And I know that someone I saw in the chat too, I know you were going through the questions about if I was to go down and visit, where should I go? There is a collective there now that if you wanted to go and see quilts, there's a way that I don't know in terms of, I think you probably would need to call ahead so they can make sure that it's open if that's your goal, that you want to go there and see it. But that is definitely a place that I would say that you would probably want to stop. Um, there isn't I didn't talk a lot about the area, but it really isn't a lot. So for example, if you wanted to go there, if when we go to visit, and if we need, say for example, unfortunately, when bad things happen in the family, if there's a death, etc., and we all go back, there really isn't enough room for all of us. So we often have to stay, for example, in the hotel. Well, you either are going to go to Selma or you're going to go to Camden, but that's not around the corner. So if they want to go to Walmart, for example, that's another 30, 40-minute drive. So it really isn't a lot right there. And to me, it's what draws me to want to go back, because if you could imagine going somewhere where life is just simpler. So the air is fresher, the food is better, the vegetables, the fruits are for everything. So it really is, for me, it's a place where I can go and just kind of breathe. And I think, that's the toss up between, do you want to have all these things readily accessible to you, or do you want to go somewhere where you can get away from it all? So another piece is that, for example, if I were to, when I go down there, if I need to make a phone call, I need to make it while I'm in Selma or I'm in Camden, because once we get in Gee's Bend, more than likely the cell phone is not going to work. I'm not going to have internet access. So, but can you imagine being in a place today in 2020 where that's an issue? So that's another reason in terms of wanting to get the word out to let people know the triumphs, yes, but there's also still struggles.
Sure.
But in the heart of it, there's just a group of people who are really grateful for what they have.
Well, and my understanding of kind of the Gee's Bend phenomenon, so to speak, is that it has risen largely because of the remoteness and the isolation of the Gee's Bend community, and the
Yes.
fact that there were not a lot of outside influences, which is why the style is so distinctive
Mhm.
in those quilts. When I was visiting with Tangela on the phone earlier, several days ago, I talked about how here at the Quilt Museum, we've discussed doing a Gee's Bend exhibit, and how kind of the discovery of the Gee's Bend quilts has really influenced or had an influence on the modern quilting movement. Because even though this Gee's Bend quilting tradition has been around for a long time, they're very modern in their makeup and their use of space and color and line. Their composition is just, it's had a lot of influence on the art world in general. And I say that I'm certainly not an art expert. I'm not even a quilt expert, actually. But it's just such a wonderful part. I also just think it's an interesting and in some ways kind of troubling that we don't recognize the value of something like the Gee's Bend quilts until, quote, the outside world places a value on it, and how many times that can be a metaphor for our own selves, you know, that we don't place a value on our own work or our own contribution to society until somebody else can validate that for us. And thankfully, the Gee's Bend quilts have come to light, and we can appreciate them for the artistic works that they are. But
I
you know,
think the interesting piece is, you know, and I just want to make sure that I'm framing it the right way. I think when I say, and I know when you say too, when we talk about valuing, I'm looking at it. So I always valued my grandmother's quilts, right? I don't know that I would have thought that someone else would have put the price tag on it that's being put on it, right? Because like I said, for me, they're invaluable. Like I'll often say, you know, if someone offered me $1 million, I don't think, you know, part of me, I always joke, if someone offered me $1 million, I say, I don't know, my grandmother might have wanted me to have that. You know what I'm saying? But I don't know that I would be able to part with it, right? So you're absolutely right. I think it is very interesting how that happens, because if no one had put that dollar figure on the quilt, would the rest of the world had seen it as invaluable as I do?
Sure.
You
Well,
know,
and then you open up the idea of what exactly is value. What exactly does it mean to place a value on something? And that term can have a lot of different definitions. You know, your
definitely.
value is different than a monetary value, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
So we got a couple more questions here in the chat window, and then I think we'll introduce a second guest if we have time. So Eliska is asking if Nancy Petway is a relative of yours, Tangela.
So I'm glad that that came up. So Petway is actually, it was a plantation name.
Okay.
So there are so many Petways. There's so
Okay.
many Petways that there's no way, even if they were all from that area, we're not all related. And so if I were probably to go to my uncle or to someone else and ask, are we related? Even if we're not related, they may be able to tell me who that family is or who that is. But for me, a lot of no, I don't know. But it's interesting enough, going back to how people, when they left, so there's a huge there's a huge population of Petways right here in Connecticut where I am right now. So you'll find some of them it's Pettway, some it's Pettaway. But yes, there's so many Petways. So we're probably from the same area, but I don't know who that individual is personally.
Sure. And then Carol is asking if someone wanted to purchase one of your aunt's small blocks, are those available? Are they part of that collective that you mentioned?
I don't know. I know that she does have some that if you were to go, I don't have the number in front of me, but I know you can look it up online. I know that there are times I believe that she may have things there, but I am on Instagram. It's at Gee's Bend. I am also on Facebook. We have a fan page. Gee's Bend Made is where you can find us. I right now have someone who's working on a website, so eventually we will be www.geesbendmade.com. But for right now, you can find me on Instagram or on Facebook.
Did I put that correctly in the chat window?
Yes, you did.
Okay. Okay. Excellent. I was just going to ask you how people could contact you
Yes.
through that. Very good. Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the impetus for having this conversation for us is that Tangela reached out to us about carrying her book in our gift shop here at the Iowa Quilt Museum. In addition to the gallery space, which I'm sitting in the gallery right now, you can see these two quilts behind me are part of our exhibit called String Theory, String Pieced Quilts from Past to Present. And we will be doing more programs in the coming Tuesdays, specifically about this exhibit. But in the front of our gift shop, we have, in the front of our museum, we have a gift shop. And so we're going to carry Tangela's book and as well as on our online gift shop. We've actually been carrying another children's book for since we opened. And this actually 3 that were written by Phyllis Kaldenberg, who is a local resident. And I just turned Phyllis's video on, so I hope you can all see it as well. Phyllis has written 3 books. Let me see if I can get them in the right order, Phyllis. The first one was The Quilt That Gave a Hug. And the second one was A Quilt for the Birds.
No, Mr. Mac.
Oh, darn it. The second one was A Quilt for Mr. Mac, which is the Quilts of Valor Foundation story. And then the third one was A Quilt for the Birds. And so Phyllis is, like I mentioned, she's a local resident, a quilter, a former educator. So the 3 of us actually share this educator connection. I actually was a former educator as well. So Phyllis, tell us, and then Tangela as well, kind of what really pushed you to go ahead and write and publish a children's book?
Well, well, I was a preschool teacher. And as I chose books to go along with the themes of whatever we were talking about, sometimes I felt like I chose a book that was just insulting to the children because I wanted the word turkey in it or something like that. And I thought, I think I could do this. And as a member of our local quilt guild, I was on a program committee one year, and we decided we would have one of the ladies be Mrs. Santa Claus and do some poems and a children's story. And I said, I'll find the Christmas quilt story. I could not find a Christmas story that had a quilt in it. And I had been to the library several times, and finally the director at the library, she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, this is what I need." And she looked at me and she says, "Well, go home and write it." And I went home and wrote this, it's a quilt that gave a hug. And my, of course, it wasn't a picture book or anything. It was just a written story, and the woman read it, and it seemed to go over well. And as time went by, this little story every year at Christmas time would kind of come back to me, but you got to have pictures, and I don't draw. And I was very fortunate. I found a gal at our church that agreed to do it. So it was like 3 or 4 years after I actually wrote the story that she the pictures, and we had a book. Wow. That was the beginning. So, and I was just really excited with your workbook that goes along your story, because I find when I read a book, I want to ask questions as I'm reading the story to children, or make other suggestions, and so yeah, that workbook is a great idea. That's really great.
And Tangela, you talked about how you wanted to connect more to your history, to the legacy of G's Bend Quilters, but why now? What gave you that actual push to go through the process?
Well, also being an educator and working with elementary students, I've always loved children's books. And now, even as an adjunct, I often say to pre-service teachers that if there's anything that you want to teach, the best way to get engagement is to read to children. And so that's always just been a part of who I am as an educator. And so if you couple that with COVID, being stuck in the house, thinking of all the things that you've always wanted to do but never had the time to do, that was really the push. That was really the push. Being able to, when the shutdown first happened, I don't care what you wanted to learn to do, there was someone on Facebook, there was someone on YouTube, there was someone somewhere showing you how to do it. And so I actually got into a group, Crystal Swain Bates is her name, and she had units with everything from the beginning to the end, how to do it. And so I just watched them. And I ended up publishing with an indie publisher, but I understood the process, which really, really helped. So that was really the push that really helped me say, okay, you know what? You have the time now, go ahead and do it. And then the other piece that I'll say, having the time to really sit with my aunt. You know, we're often on the phone. So she would say something to me, and immediately, without even thinking, I say, you know what? Someone should write that in a book. I said that so much, so I finally decided, you know what? I'm going to write that in a book. And so that's where Pearl and Her G's Been Quilt, that's where it was born.
Awesome. So it's, you know, that removal of our excuse of I don't have enough time. Phyllis, had you already retired when you wrote your book?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I had, well, might not have, but by the time we published it, I had. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And then just seeing a need and filling it. I think that that's so often what the best things come from, is seeing a need and deciding that you're just going to be the person to fill that need, which is wonderful. So to the publishing process now, I mean, this isn't a how-to for how to publish your own children's book, but maybe what's been the most surprising thing to you about the process of learning how to create a children's book and get it published?
I think for me, and Phyllis touched on it a little bit, was the whole piece of the illustration. You know, I think I really underestimated the amount of time that it would take to get a book illustrated. And then I think I've learned to, and she's wonderful. I'm going to work with her again. Excellent. But being able to trust someone with your idea to come back with their vision, and then to see where that gets you. Because it's very easy to say, okay, first do this, then I want you to do this and do this and do this and do that. But to also realize that sometimes someone else's vision can push your vision. And so I really think in this book, that's what happened here, you know, in terms of what I wanted and the quilts that I wanted and the examples that I gave her, but then also allowing her the creativity to use her strengths to help it come to life. And so for me, that was the biggest aha.
I've heard that same conversation in relationship to quilting when it comes to actually quilt a top. You know, somebody creates a top and then giving that off to the quilter to allow them to use their own creativity to make that into a finished project. Not quite the same, obviously, but
I can see the similarities.
Yeah,
I
sure.
can definitely see it.
Phyllis, how about you? What surprised you the most about this process, or what was your greatest learning moment from the process of writing a
Probably
story?
several things, but it's not a cheap thing either. There's an expense involved, but it's self-publishing. That means you are also the one that is the peddler, the marketer. And so that meant I went to quilt shops and museums and this, but again, there's a point where you have to kind of look at the cost, and to drive 4 or 5 hours to a quilt shop, there's no profit in doing that. So I was very fortunate. My illustrator had a sister who was a graphic designer, and so she was able to take my words and her sister's pictures and put them together and magically get them into the printer. I don't know how any of that that works, and we got a book at the end. Yeah, so yeah, marketing. And you know, I just don't want to pull a little red wagon around and do that. So word of mouth. And That's
Well,
way.
we're thankful to have been able to carry your book here at the Quilt Museum. And, you know, because of that, we feel like people from across the country have a
Yes.
copy of The Quilt That Gave the Hug, or A Quilt for the Birds, or A Quilt for Mr. Mac in their homes now. And Tangela, we look forward to doing the same thing for yours.
Mhm.
I'm going to put the link one more time in the chat window of how to find our online store. This is our direct link to the store. You can also find it just from our website, which is iowaquiltmuseum.org. And Tangela's books and Phyllis's books are front page of our online gift shop and our featured items right now. So if you click on them, you can't miss them. And as I said, for Tangela's book, we're doing pre-orders right now. And in a couple of days, I will place a real order and Tangela will ship those to me. And then I'll ship them out to everybody who has ordered. Is there anybody else who wants to pop into the chat window or go ahead and turn your video on if you want to say something to Tangela or Phyllis or ask a question specifically? This doesn't need to be a kind of one-sided conversation. We're happy to have people pop on if they want to say something. I will answer at least Eliska's question, which is where will this recording be available? So it actually will be posted to YouTube, but then it will go on our Facebook page and our website, which is iowaquiltmuseum.org. But you can find all of our past programs there as well. This is the first of our series of virtual Iowa Quiltscape sessions. And so we'll be meeting up each Tuesday at 12 for these sessions. Thank you to Tangela for being our guinea pig here and getting us kicked off. I think it was Friday that I called her and said, hey, you want to do this thing on Tuesday? And she said, sure, why not? So she's a good sport. Next week, we will be talking with Roderick Kirikoff and Siobhan Ferguson about the quilts that they have in the exhibit. This one right here is Siobhan's. And then we have 11 quilts in the exhibit that are on loan to us from Roderick Kirikoff. And he has a couple of books in print as well. Tangela has put in her email into the chat window as well, if you'd like to reach out to her that way. Patty wants you to become an online member of her guild, which is awesome.
Patty, send me information to my email, please.
And I'm just gonna put one more link in. Actually, I'm gonna put two more links into the chat window. This one is a direct link that will take you to the, allow you to sign up for the email list served from the Iowa Quilt Museum. I promise we will not sell your email address. I promise we will not flood your inbox. No more than once a week do I send anything, and even that's pretty rare. 2 to 3 times a month, we send out an update on what's happening in events. But because we are doing so many online events right now, that's a good way to stay apprised of what we were doing. And the last link is, if you are appreciating this program and feel so inclined to make a monetary donation to the Iowa Quilt Museum, you can click on that link. It is not something that we expect, but we are always grateful if you are able to support our activities in that way. So any last comments from either of you, Tangela or Phyllis?
I just want to thank everyone for their time. You know, the idea that, you know, people were interested enough to log in and they wanted to hear about our story. So I definitely appreciate that, and the support from the comments in the chat as well. So yes, send me information about your guild. Yes, contact me if you would like to have your local bookstores carry the books. I really, really appreciate that. Phyllis's point about being the marketer and trying to get the word out, those words ring true. It is very challenging, but so I appreciate anyone who has that interest and just wants to get Pearl and her G's Bend quilt out there. So I thank you so much.
Yeah. Phyllis, anything more from you?
Well, not so much about the book, but I'm sitting here thinking, when is the museum going to have one of their exhibits of G's Bend quilts?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
We actually have talked about that. And I think I alluded to this earlier, we would like to do that kind of our context for that exhibit in how it has influenced the modern quilting world. So maybe a Gee's Bend exhibit in combination with a modern quilt exhibit. That is definitely something we've talked about. And we try to schedule 2 years out or such. We're fairly well scheduled we're all the way scheduled for this year, and we're scheduling into 2022 right now. So when I meet with the exhibit committee next, I will share with them that there is a desire to see those quilts on exhibit in this neck of the woods.
And then maybe you could convince the Connecticut lady to come.
Yes.
Oh.
And good Lord willing, quick don't rise, I'll take you to lunch.
That sounds good. We just need to do something with COVID first, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Get it out of the way.
Sounds like a plan.
Absolutely.
If a quilt guild needs a good program when COVID's over, the Gee's Bend ladies that came to our guild did a beautiful job. They did just like you did. They told stories, and they even sang to us, which they could really sing well. If you don't mind, I'd like to hold up the little quilt just to give another example of a Gee's Bend quilt. I have a small one, and I'll hold it up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Beautiful.
Oh, that is fun.
My favorite color is purple. I had to get this one.
And that's got some, I think, some Red Hat Society fabrics in it, it looks like, maybe.
She calls it Red Hats or Red Hot.
Okay.
I can't really read what it is. But it was made by Nancy Pettway, and the date on it she has is 1-15. So I guess it was maybe 2015.
Nice. Thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate it.
Beautiful.
Oh shoot. Sorry, I just stopped the video. I didn't mean to. Do feel free to join us next week, Tuesdays at 12. From now, actually through the first 2 weeks of March. We'll be on every week. Hope to have you join us again. Thank you so much to Tangela for joining us as our featured guest today, and for Phyllis for popping on and joining our conversation about publishing children's books. Hop on to the Iowa Quilt Museum gift shop and order your copy of Pearl and her Gee's Bend quilt, or the coloring and activity book. And you can also shop there for copies of The Quilt That Gave a Hug, A Quilt for Mr. Mac, and A Quilt for the Birds, which are Phyllis's books. Again, my name is Megan Barrett. I'm the director at the Iowa Quilt Museum. You can learn more all about the Iowa Quilt Museum at iowaquiltmuseum.org. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've made it almost to an hour, which is amazing. Once we get going, we can just really talk forever, it feels like. But we'll hope to see you all next week, and have a lovely day. Thanks.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.